How are you? Welcome to Telesur Critical Move. The COVID-19 pandemic has caused, among its various negative effects, a global oil crisis. In this context, OPEC and non-OPEC countries agreed to stabilize the market. What does this agreement consist of? How did they get to this? Which countries drove this initiative? How does this influence global geopolitics? Let's display the board, and we're making the first move. As I said, the OPEC Plus meeting finally took place on Thursday by video conference. Listen to statements prior and after the resulting agreement. I believe that it is necessary to combine efforts in order to balance the market and reduce production. According to preliminary figures, the cuts will be in the range of 10 million barrels per day, maybe a little more or less. We are alarmed by the growth of commercial oil reserves and the possibility of completely filling up oil storage facilities. This may lead to serious consequences for the oil industry and the global economy as a whole. These circumstances require immediate and timely measures, and we need to join forces to alter the situation associated with the significant overproduction of oil in the world. We had a very good talk with Russia and Saudi leaders. We'll see what happens, but as you know, OPEC met today, and I would say that they come into an agreement. We'll soon find out. Articles came out in the newspapers wanting to blame us, that because of us, there was an agreement, and we talked. President Trump communicated with us. I talked to him, and we came to an agreement to cut 100,000 barrels. The United States undertakes to additionally reduce to what he was going to deliver, 250,000. Says President Trump that because for Mexico, in order to compensate. So from 1,786,000 barrels on average, or for March, we came down to 1,686,000 barrels. This applies from May. These were the statements by Mexico President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in the morning press briefings that he did this Friday. And we also listened to statements by President Nicolás Maduro, even though I clarified with Twitter statement. Let's take a closer look at the OPEC's origins and evolution. What is it about? What principles govern it? Let's find out. OPEC, the regulatory mechanism for the oil market. The Organization of Oil-Producing Countries, OPEC, is an intergovernmental entity with its headquarters in Vienna, Austria. It was established with the aim of coordinating the oil production policies of the 14 member countries. OPEC was founded in 1960 in Baghdad, the Iraqi capital. Its founding members are Venezuela, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the host country, all of which were the world's top exporters. However, it was not recognized by the United Nations until 2 years later, on December 6, 1962. Then Qatar, Libya, Indonesia, United Arab Emirates, Ecuador, Nigeria, Gabon, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, and the Republic of the Congo were added. Venezuela's participation was fundamental to materialize OPEC Foundation. The purpose of this organization is to establish the international oil market, offer guidance to oil-producing countries to obtain return on their investments, and to ensure the continuous and stable oil supply for consumer countries. Currently, OPEC countries produce 40% of the global fuel and 14% of natural gas. 81% of the global oil reserve are in member countries of the organization. In 2016, OPEC formed an alliance with independent crude oil producers under a joint commitment to reduce production by 1.8 million barrels per day. This group, known as OPEC Plus, incorporated 10 nations, including Russia, Mexico, and Kazakhstan. In order to go deeper into what was achieved by this agreement, I invite you to consult a Reuters article titled Saudi Arabia and Russia Sign Agreement for Cutting Oil Production. A communique from the group, known as OPEC Plus, said that will adjust downward its overall crude production by approximately 10% of the world oil supply, and that it expects that other countries such as the United States join the agreement and cooperate with the pumping reduction of another 5 million barrels per day. All members will reduce their production by 23%, with Saudi Arabia and Russia cutting 2.5 million barrels per day each, and Iraq more than 1 million barrels per day. The group detailed that the total adjustment agreed will decrease to 8 million BPDs until December, and then to 6 million barrels per day between January 2021 to April 2022. Sources from the group and Russia said that expect the cut to include contributions of up to 5 million barrels from the United States and other nations, but the communique did not mention conditions so that countries outside the group reduce their production. Previous talks had been complicated by clashes between Saudi Arabia and Russia, but which I will mention later, but the parties agreed on Thursday that the cuts will be made on the basis of a production of 11 million barrels per day for both countries. In order to understand about this clash between Saudi Arabia and Russia, I recommend this article, What Prevents the Oil Agreement Between Russia and Riyadh, written by Qasim Eseddin and published in the Al-Mahajin website on April 8th. Some of its paragraphs read as follows. The dispute between Saudi Arabia and Russia may be one of the reasons why the emergency meeting expected to be held on Monday was rescheduled for an unspecified date. We'll talk about the 8th. However, the disagreement about the market shares, which caused the oil markets to sink after the COVID-19 pandemic, may include other non-oil related contradictory strategies that are difficult to overcome according to calculations of the world prices. President Putin insisted in holding Saudi Arabia responsible for the price war due to the latter's refusal to extend the agreement that lasted 3 years and 3 months, and its insistence to cut oil production with the pretext of preserving the largest market share at the expense of smaller oil-producing countries and Russia's long-term quotas. It is inevitable to cut back production due to the sinking market and the COVID-19 pandemic. Putin stated that the reduction would be collective, which would lead to a reduction of Saudi Arabia participation and losing its world top reducing its status. When the previous agreement between Saudi Arabia and Russia entered into force early 2017, Putin agreed that Saudi Arabia would maintain the lion's share of the approximately 12 million barrels per day, despite recognizing later that this moved through OPEC's smaller producing countries to the wolves. Putin has bet on approaching Saudi Arabia to pull it away from the United States, and this was done through investment projects meeting Bin Salman's Vision 2030 in nuclear energy projects and the sales of the X-400 missile system, but Bin Salman rejected this rapprochement under Trump's pressure. In this context, Moscow considers Saudi Arabia's withdrawal from the previous agreement as a turning its back on the whole offer, bowing to Trump's pressure, which seeks to destroy the Russian economy and dry up Venezuelan and Iranian economies mainly. Rather, maybe Putin sees a strategic interest in eliminating the U.S. shale oil and urging the Congress to continue. I lost track my line. I lost test because the app is bailing on me. Let me see whether I can get back to the text. Let me see. And I continue reading down. Moscow, I see that. Here it is. Strategic interest in and urging the Congress to continue its threats against Saudi Arabia with the hope that Russia would get the gas exports from the northern pipelines and the Arctic to Canada and the United States in the short term. What increases the seriousness of the Russian bet is that oil production as a whole opens up the way for many issues, according to Goldman Sachs, expert in production and marketing. After being left without storage space, and tankers loaded with oil became gallons. While it's not possible to estimate the need for the wheel of the economy in the foreseeable future after the coronavirus crisis regarding the excess amounts. In this context, the executive director of the International Energy Agency said that if output declines in approximately 10 million barrels per day, oil reserves will continue to have an excess inventory of more than 15 million barrels over the market demand. And to complement this information, with information from Lisandra, our correspondent in Moscow. How are you, Lisandra?
Sí, muchas gracias, Rey. Un
Very well,
saludo
thank you,
para
Ray.
ti.
Greetings
La
to you.
reunión virtual de los
The virtual
países del
meeting of the
mecanismo OPEC
OPEC
Plus, que
Plus
duró
country,
alrededor de
which
10 horas
lasted
desde
about
finales
10
de la
hours
noche del jueves y hasta
from
principios
late
de la
last
mañana
night to
del
early
viernes, pues terminó
Friday
con un
morning,
acuerdo
ended
mayoritario,
with a majority
principalmente
agreement.
Rusia y Arabia
Mainly
Saudita
Russia and
lograron
the
finalmente
Saudi
ponerse
Arabia
de acuerdo,
finally
lo
came
que
to an agreement
reducirá la
to
producción en un
reduce
23% al
oil
mismo
output
nivel,
to
alrededor de
23%,
8.5
around
millones de
8.5
barriles por día.
barrels per day.
Contrariamente al
Contrary to
escepticismo
the
que habrían algunos
skepticism
analistas,
by
Rusia y
some
Arabia Saudita
Russian
por fin
analysts,
lograron
Russia
ponerse de acuerdo en
and
esta
Saudi Arabia
reducción
came to an
petrolera. Los dos
agreement
mayores
for this
productores de
oil
crudo del
reduction.
mundo, pues,
The two
acordaron reducir
the
la
two
misma
top
cantidad,
largest
una
oil
disminución
producers in the
para
country
los dos países
and
a un
the
solo
same
nivel de
amount
producción. En
of
total,
both countries to a same level of production. In
los
total,
países de esta
the
alianza OPEC Plus,
countries
como se
of
esperaba,
OPEC
pues,
Plus,
reducirán la
as
producción
expected,
petrolera
reduce
en
their
alrededor de
oil
10
output
millones de
in
barriles por
10
día
million
durante
barrels
mayo
per
y
day
junio.
for May and
Luego,
June.
durante los meses de
Then
julio a
in the
diciembre, pues, la
months of
reducción
June to December, the
será de
reduction
alrededor de
will
8
be
millones
of
de
around
barriles y
8
desde enero
million
del
barrels per
2021
day,
hasta
and
finales de
from
abril del
January
2022,
2021
pues la
to
cifra será
April
de 6
2022,
millones.
the figure will be 6
Históricamente,
million.
pues, como se
Historically,
esperaba, casi ninguna reunión del
none of
mecanismo
this
OPEC Plus está
meeting of the OPEC
exenta
Plus
de
is
sorpresas, y
free
en
of
esta ocasión,
surprises.
pues, los
This time
observadores
around,
esperaban
the
que
observers
hubiera un largo
were
debate
expecting a
entre los
long
representantes
debate
de Rusia y
among
Arabia Saudita,
between
así
representatives
como
from
duras
Russia and Saudi
declaraciones por
Arabia and
parte
tough
de Irán,
statements
pero
by
en
Iran.
esta
But
ocasión
this
las
time around,
dificultades
the
vinieron desde
difficulties
una
came
dirección
from
inesperada,
an
pues fue México, el
unexpected
país que
direction
no
because it
estuvo
was
en esta
Mexico,
ocasión
the
de
country
acuerdo con las
which was not
negociaciones. Según el
in
plan
agreement with
propuesto,
the
se
negotiations.
pedía que
According to
México
plans,
redujera la
Mexico was
producción a
expected to
un nivel de
reduce production to
1.75 millones de
1.7
barriles por día,
million
una
barrels
propuesta
per
que no
day,
fue aceptada por los
which was
mexicanos,
not
pero finalmente
accepted
los
by Mexico.
participantes de
But
esta
finally,
reunión
the
virtual, pues,
participants in this
anunciaron
virtual
que tras la
meeting
horas de
announced that
discusión,
after
este
long
acuerdo para
hours of
reducir la
discussion,
producción
this
petrolera a
agreement
10
to
millones
reduce
de barriles diarios sigue
oil
siendo
to
válida,
10
pero
million
debe
barrels
ser
is still
pactada
valid,
en esta
but must
jornada
be
con México,
agreed upon
pues
with
continuarán estas
Mexico.
negociaciones como
So
parte
this
de un seminario
negotiation
web
will
que tendrán
continue as
los
part of
países
web
miembros del
and
grupo G20,
negotiations
que, como
as part of
decíamos,
the
está
G20
programada para
countries
este viernes.
as
Por
scheduled
tanto,
for
en
this
este
Friday.
escenario, varios
So in this
analistas
scenario,
consideran y
several
predicen
analysts
una
say that
recuperación
they
en los
foresee
en
a
los
recovery
precios
in the
petroleros
oil
para finales
prices
de este
for
año, que puede estar por
late
encima
this
de
year
los
that
55
could be
dólares
over
por barril, y por
$55
tanto
per
para
barrel.
Rusia habrá
And
una
therefore
dinámica
for
más
Russia there
estable
will
del
be a more
petróleo y de
stable
ambos
dynamics
rubros,
for oil
pues parece probable lograr esto sobre la
as
base
it
de las
is likely
discusiones
that this
finales
will be
del
passed
tema
according
de
to
la
the
producción y la
discussions
reducción
in
del
terms of
precio
production
petrolero que
and the
tendrá
oil
lugar, como
prices
ya
which
decíamos
will
hoy,
take
en el
place
formato
today
del
in the
G20.
format of
Esta es
G20.
toda la
This is
información que
the
tenemos por
information that
ahora
I
desde
had
la
for you.
señal a Caracas.
Back to you in the studio.
Muchísimas gracias, Lisandra, por esta
Thank you,
información
Lisandra,
desde
for the
Moscú,
information
nuestra
from Moscow, our
corresponsal
correspondent,
Lisandra Andrés. Vamos entonces a
Lisandra
establecer la pausa, como siempre le
Andres.
digo, usted puede
Let's go back to
convertirse en
our
analista más en nuestra
break,
jugada
and
crítica,
you can be
como
also, you can
correspondiendo
become an
nuestra
analyst in
pregunta de la
our
jugada estratégica. Ya
responding
tenemos
our
en pantalla,
strategic
en
move
medio de la crisis que
on
ha
the
dejado
screen
la
in the
pandemia
midst of the
del
crisis
COVID-19 en el
left by
mercado
the
petrolero mundial,
COVID-19
países
pandemic in the
OPEC
world
Plus
market.
acuerdan reducir
OPEC
la
Plus
producción
countries
para
agreed to
estabilizar
cut
los
down
precios.
production to
¿Qué
stabilize
espera?
prices.
Opine, dénos
What
su
should we
criterio. Ahí
expect?
aparece una
Give
fotografía
us your views.
de la
This is a photo
videoconferencia a
of
través de la
the
cual se
video
realizó
conference
esa
whereby
reunión
the meeting
este
took place
jueves.
on
Vamos a la
Thursday.
pausa,
Let's
regresamos
go
en
to a
breve.
break and
Acompáñanos.
we'll be back soon. Stay with us.
Para darle seguimiento
Just to follow up
a las
on the
informaciones
information
que están
received
suscitando
on this meeting of OPEC Plus, we are just reading the Twitter by Rocío Nacle, Mexico's energy secretary, and we see it on the board. She was participating, representing Mexico. In the G20, countries willing to cooperate according to their possibilities. Mexico expressed its solidarity and willingness to contribute to the stabilization of the oil market, as President López Obrador said. And then we bring about this tweet from the Mexico Energy Secretary to dispel the myth by some media saying that Mexico did not agree with the proposals by OPEC. Even López Obrador himself, in his daily briefing, he said that we are willing, they have the political willingness to cooperate on the basis of the reality which Mexico is living through in oil terms. They are not putting up an obstacle, but all the contrary. And I'm saying this because verbally he said it in his daily morning briefing. Some media outlets are saying what is not really the case. So let's move forward. The global oil barrel records suffered a steep decline during the first quarter of 2020 due to several factors, among them mainly the coronavirus pandemic crisis. Let's review the figures and forecasts. The world oil market closed the first quarter of the year, recording its greatest losses in history, according to official reports. Added to the hard blow suffered in March by the Brent and West Texas Intermediate indexes due to the meltdown of the global economy activity on account of the crisis of the pandemic and the price wars between Saudi Arabia and Russia, it's the failure to reach an agreement at the beginning of the year to cut oil production. West Texas Intermediate crude ended March with a fall of minus 66.82%, the worst losses recorded since 1983, and losing about $40.89 per barrel. The Brent, for its part, dipped about $43 per barrel, the largest quarterly descent in its history, and remained at 65.70% below its normal price. In addition, the stock exchanges in Asia, Europe, and the United States fell sharply. Japan and China's economic data revived concerns about the crisis affecting the whole world. Economists observe that global fuel demand has been shattered by travel restrictions due to COVID-19, so they forecast a 20 to 30% collapse in demand. According to data from the International Energy Agency, the world's largest oil and gas companies, including British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, and Petrobras, have applied cost reduction after the oil prices collapse. The cuts amount to $20 billion and an under 20% decline against the original $142 billion spending plans. In the midst of the crisis caused by the COVID-19, the countries of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and their independent partners, which is known as OPEC Plus, materialized a cooperation agreement to achieve energy market stability by implementing a 23% production cut equivalent to 10 million barrels for May and June. That's the context that leads us to the first part of our interview at Critical Move. From Mexico, we're accompanied by Nidia Agremi, internationalist from the Mexico UNAM, expert in geopolitics, and from Montreal, Susana Halil, politologist. Welcome, both of you. We have Susana on screen. Nidia is on the phone. I will stay with Susana for during these 30 minutes. Welcome, Susana, once again to Critical Move of Telesur. Your first assessment of this agreement between OPEC and non-OPEC countries in the context of the pandemic. Thank you so much. Just allow me to clarify a couple of points in terms of oil. Oil is the resource for contemporary civilization. Whether there are other alternatives, that's not the case. And our reality continues to be oil. That is on the one hand. It is also important to highlight that petroleum has not been reduced to gasoline. There are thousands of other of other industry needs. For instance, in medicine, electricity, plastic, petrochemicals, and then oil is like a fabric of multi-presential factor in contemporary life. On the other hand, and also concerning the virus, the COVID-19, I believe that we're facing the first bacteriological world war. Because why do I say that? Because this virus definitively was launched with a purpose. Uh, this is not something natural, and that is was against uh, what is the intention of was intended against the emergence of other alternatives like Russia, China, Iran, and other countries that wanted to start or to start a multipolar world or to reduce the hegemonism. And this virus is a war modality. So this virus has affected this resource of contemporary civilization, which is oil. Now, a world quarantine has been imposed, so then it is then that the oil prices collapsed. There is no consumption, oil consumption. There is no dynamics we have had. So there is a radical decline in oil prices. Now, on the one hand, the Saudi tyranny is playing a very perverse role, which is nothing new within OPEC. They usually play that perverse role, and they speak about increasing production. Uh, and this perversity, this is awkward, it's very clumsy because it doesn't make any sense to increase production today. It's like putting sand into the desert. So they don't have any other choice but to backtrack and to see the reality, which is decline, cut oil production because of the reality of the virus imposes that. Because it is leading the mankind to isolate in a quarantine because this virus is a real threat. Analysts agree that Saudi Arabia has acted historically that way, Susana, under pressure by the United States. Why, in this case, do they agree to backtrack and even turning their backs on what the United States has indicated, according to analysts? They are backtracking and they are not turning their backs on the US. It seems so, but it's not the case. First, I have to say that within the many things that for oil, the reason of existence of this tyranny is the oil. But it's not the issue. The issue is that it seems that the United States that the Saudi Arabia is disobeying the U.S., but also the oil price decline affects the United States. I will bring up that in the 60s, Ronald Reagan said OPEC it will come to its knees, and the oil prices declined. They had Texan oilmen had to go see the president say and tell Ronald Reagan that because there's an oil tradition in the U.S. and the oilmen had to tell Donald Trump, Ronald Reagan, not so low because we are affecting as well. So at this point in time, it seems that the Saudi Arabia is turning their backs on the U.S. or change their awkward positions in addition to being awkward and perverse. But no one is to gain from the steep decline in oil prices, and it's not because Saudi Arabia is going to rebel against the U.S. But the U.S. was the one telling them that they have to change their positions. Thus, in broad strokes, but no one is to gain from this situation, and the oil derivatives is also affected. So it is awkward, it is clumsy, because the merchant ships is able to do this when the unions are also on the quarantine. So we have to be careful when we're saying that Saudi Arabia is turning their backs on the U.S. No, Saudi Arabia is a neo-colony that belongs to the United States that responds to imperial interests, and the reason for existence is their support or the United States. To conclude, just let me say that the United States is not to gain from the declining oil prices because they also have an oil producing tradition in the United States and they are also stand to lose. However, let's not forget that the United States, during the beginning of this last century, they enabled a drastic decline of oil prices through the implementation of fracking to get shale gas. If you allow me, Susana, let me bring in Nia Egremy. She's on the line from Mexico. I'm so glad to have her from Mexico because this is another aspect that I want to reflect upon on this critical move. Nidia, welcome to our show. What is Mexico's position to understand this issue better? Thank you for the invitation. As has been said here, oil is today a social political asset, and this agreement that is going to stabilize the market to improve oil prices is marking, and the country that stands to gain the most from this part will be where power will be displaced in the coming years. So let me comment and I remind you that the insidious role of the corporate media that some hours ago were took for granted that Mexico had repudiated this agreement, and with that they clouded the perception of Mexico in the region. However, as you were saying now, in his daily briefing, President López Obrador explained very well that an industry practically dismantled by neoliberalism, like the Mexican oil industry, could not stand a reduction between 20 to 23% daily cutback because they barely reached the production of the first quarter of March to 1.7 million barrels per day. That's unavoidable. So that is why, after this explanation by the president, they came to an agreement to reduce by 100,000 barrels per day, and the United States, as a unilateral act, by the commitments taken, the United States was going to cut back additionally, in addition to his proposal, 250,000 barrels that Mexico was supposed to cut. In this case, what we would have, in order to round up my line of thinking, is that to mark, especially to highlight that this agreement by OPEC Plus, which is in a very complex geopolitical context, the consequences of this agreement will be felt as of May 1st, when this agreement comes into force in June. And of course, the attitude of the United States, which has been key in provoking this oil price crisis from March, when they effectively, in our horizon, the secondary purpose of these war prices is but to put Russia into a corner, as well as Iran and Venezuela, whose economies have been heavily affected by the unilateral measures of the United States. And also, these are major oil producers. And on the other hand, to open up the market to the invasion of shale oil from the United States, which is the country that stands to win the most from this crisis. Thank you, Nidia. And I'm gonna start from that on the second moment for reflection with Susanna. As Susanna said, about 5, 6 years ago, the U.S., through implementing fracking to extract shale gas, provoked a drastic oil price decline, affecting Venezuela among other countries. However, now the United States is welcoming this agreement. As you said, Saudi Arabia changes its position in order to also welcome this position, led by Putin's Russia, because collectively, said Putin, is the way to reduce international oil production in order to revitalize oil prices in the world market. Susanna, why now? Why now? Why now the United States stand in line and not 5 years ago? Does it have to do with today the United States is the epicenter of the COVID-19 pandemic? What happens is that, unfortunately, what is happening in the United States with this health crisis has affected the American people. Now, what's important to highlight is that as part of this regrettable health situation worldwide, is that within the epicenter of of, of this resource for the contemporary civilization, which is oil, when we say we're going to enter into an agreement, but it must be a joint, a common agreement, a collective agreement. I think this is a great news because we are just in the previous stages of a multipolar world. So when we say that everyone has to collectively come to an agreement to reduce oil production, because we are calling on mankind, the world population, to be in a quarantine, so we cannot throw human beings to death, but also oil, the reduction in oil production has been provoked by quarantine. It could be kind of naive on my part, but without a doubt, it has to do with breaking with the hegemonism and go to a multipolar world, regardless of whether each of the different positions have their own interests. Of course, Russia has its own interests. Of course, Iran has its own interests, like China. But the most important thing is that it's not the interest of only one, but the interest of all. So therefore, for example, in Venezuela's position, through with the arrival of the Bolivarian Revolution, uh, they have also been claiming for a multipolar world because it would mean a more democratic, a more free world, a world for human rights, a world of less poverty, a world of less interference in internal affairs. So now the United States is facing a tragedy of thousands of affected people by COVID-19. So they have to lead us into a collective reflection. And as part of this tragedy, neoliberalism and corporations and bureaucracies should not be the ones to stand to gain and to recycle in this. So that is, mankind must be on the alert and should come out of its comfort zone. And it says that the international public opinion is not naive, but they are in the comfort zone. So that's the importance of mobilization, because mobilization is part of human freedom. So we insist on two elements: the health crisis. I believe that we are in the midst of the war because the virus was launched introduced by the United States to prevent or to disturb or to destroy the progress, the economic progress, the economy in China, and that was some sort of Frankenstein. And I would dare say also that Trump did not care if 200,000 people die, because we have to remember that they have a fascist logic, and that logic is supported by religious sentiments, and it is atrocious, but these are the realities of today's Nazism in the United States. Thank you, Susana. Just to conclude, in just 1 minute, I would like to have your view. How could we move forward on the basis of this agreement? Will there be political willingness on the part of the U.S. government, for instance, to respect, to observe what was agreed with the international community by OPEC and other non-OPEC countries, but who are also committed to reduce their oil output in order to revitalize oil prices? In principle, we're just taking a first step. But of course, we cannot forget that the pandemic marked a turning point. The strategic factors are changing. There's been talk, and I want to underscore this, that an unknown virus, more than decades of imperialist struggle, because we're moving from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And the pandemic is leaving us a horrendous lesson, with more than 1 million cases of affected patients, 150,000 deaths, but also it's leaving us this bomb that cannot be repeated, a war price for oil price, and the inertia by a lethal disease. The United States, I repeat, is a key player in this equation with the shale oil. Of course, they are going to continue exploiting it and flooding the market with shale petroleum. But the greater positive lesson is that this multipolar world that is opening up was shown over the last 12 hours in this meeting of OPEC Plus. And last, we shouldn't forget that Trump is acting that way because in a few months' time, the decision will be made whether he will continue at the White House, and so he's playing this card, the electoral card as well. Very interesting what you just said. Everything has to be seen when it comes to the United States in terms of electoral key. Thank you, Nidia, also Susana, for your time with Telesur's Critical Move. We're going to a break again. There's a question on our social media for you to participate, and the question is, in the midst of the crisis or by the COVID-19 in the world market, in the oil world market, OPEC countries agreed to reduce production. Give us your opinion. On our way back, we'll be talking to a guest accompanying with us in the studio. Being a top oil producer seems to be one of the reasons for the United States government to implement coercive measures against OPEC and non-OPEC countries that do not align with the White House policies. Let's review. Coercive and unilateral measures imposed by the United States government against OPEC and non-OPEC countries has influenced the decline in world oil production. Venezuela, Iran, and Russia are nations to which the most of the U.S. sanctions have been applied to. In the particular case of Caracas, since January 2019, Donald Trump, the government, handed control of state-run Petróleos de Venezuela, PDVSA, to opposition lawmaker Juan Guaidó, the self-proclaimed interim president of Venezuela. Likewise, the U.S. imposed sanctions which froze $7 billion in assets of PDVSA subsidiary Citgo, in addition to an estimated loss of $11 billion of its future exports in the coming years, as it prohibits companies from negotiating with PDVSA. Since the imposition of sanctions against this company in January 2019, U.S. authorities have been concerned about oil companies from other countries would help the government of President Nicolas Maduro to get around the blockade imposed by Washington. The penalties to PDVSA affect an important part of the world's oil industry, which needs Venezuelan heavy oil to mix it with lighter oil to produce gasoline and other refined products. As an OPEC member, Venezuela has been emphatic in requesting the support of the countries signing the Declaration of Cooperation for Voluntary Adjustment of Oil Production to resolve in a concerted manner the geopolitical issues affecting not only the Caribbean nation but also other members of the organization. And we'll go deeper into the geopolitical analysis, and we're doing it with Emmanuel Sutherland. I'm sorry for shaking your hand, Emmanuel, before the break, but you complied with the disinfection protocols before getting into the channel. But in order for you to see that we are also observing the norms, I will put my mask. So, Manuel, we saw a global agreement between OPEC and non-OPEC countries, practically unprecedented. The truth is that this agreement was extremely necessary. We are seeing that because of COVID, the oil demand declined by 20 to 30% million barrels of oil per day, approximately, and we are talking about loss of almost 30% of world demand. As you said in this show correctly, it has led to the worst decline in prices of West Texas and Brent over the last 35 years. Almost $40, $45, $50 in the price indicators have been lost. So the COVID pandemic does not even affect the oil industry. It's very destructive. And this is an issue that has been leading the world economy into a strong recession in this first quarter. This unprecedented agreement is establishing to decline the daily offer by 15%. So this means that even it would fall short, because they are talking about the demand decline by to 30 million barrels, and so they're telling us it's just a temporary solution. This is the antecedent of another agreement, a subsequent agreement in terms of the oil price, because the price declined in a very severe way. In the midst of this, what about the countries which are heavily reliant on oil? It's very serious what is happening to whose budgets depend heavily on oil income. There are countries who are mono exporters. Whatever they export is mostly oil. So if the oil budgets they don't have a previous savings, it's impossible for them to assume the losses and the expenses of any government. So what they're saying now is that they're trying to alleviate these effects in these countries, and many of these countries are under sanctions by the U.S. and it has been the perfect storm for these economies and have put them in extreme difficulties. You can see as the responsible for these sanctions is the United States, because is affected by this international crisis. They agreed to be part of this agreement. Yes, the United States government has been assisting or have been replacing oil imports with shale oil. They have been increasing from 3.5 million barrels to almost 5 million barrels. The point is that the shale oil is very expensive to process. It's more costly in processing it. However, it was a political weapon used by the Barack Obama government against Venezuela, for example. Yes, there's a lot of wells that have very high prices. So we're talking of 20, 25, $23 per barrel. Practically, it has a $17 loss. So these wells have to be closed. So that means that practically 10 million people who in the United States live from the gas and oil, shale oil industry, they lose their jobs, they make low wages, and these are investments, and this could be a very strong economy impact in the U.S. economy that could lead the world economy into further recession. Even U.S. media are saying in these days that a pandemic parallel to the COVID-19 is the 17 unemployed, jobless citizens in the United States. Yes, we're talking about that this could be 5% of the U.S. Population, and this is an unemployment veiled and underestimated unemployment, because many people stop looking for jobs. And they leave this list, and this list there are only people actively seeking jobs and who have received income over the last 2 months. In the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, those who have access to this test, which is not the real figure. Problem is that in the United States, the COVID tests are very costly, so the majority of people cannot afford them. So it's a clause in the medical insurance that if the WHO says there is a pandemic, the insurance is not forced to pay for the medical expenses that this pandemic causes. So this makes people not to have $10,000, $15,000 to pay for medical expenses, even when the businesses, companies are closing down and people are without jobs at present. Just to finish our reflection, what positives do you observe in this agreement with the OPEC Plus? I think it was very important to try to organize themselves in order to stop the war price between Saudi Arabia and Russia, which had took the oil prices to historic lows. The states must reduce their offer and maintain stabilized oil production. Also, people have been aware of the seriousness of world problems, and they need to tackle these world problems with international multilateral solutions. Also, this is a very important opportunity for countries under sanctions, under draconian sanctions and unjust sanctions, could somehow sell their oil futures in alternative markets on equal footing. And countries like China, for instance, is buying a lot of oil to storage. These countries on the sanctions could sell their oil in futures, and it could, as you were asking in the beginning, it could help their affected economies by COVID, by the decline in oil prices, and the situation to have a budget dependent on oil exports. So this is an opportunity for these countries to replenish their reserves, to sell this oil in the future, and to be able to come out of the crisis. Thank you so much, Manuel, for your inputs. Conclusions. It is still too soon to see the results of this oil agreement on the ground. The fact that they have sat at the negotiation table in a virtual way to come to consensus regarding the crisis that has caused the COVID-19 pandemic with regards to oil prices during the first quarter of the year, it is a ray of hope facing the coming months, especially because the agreement is signed with permission of the usual boycotter, also in this field, the United States. Let's not forget the crisis generated by the White House with the extraction of shale gas through fracking in the past 5 years.
¿Es esta
Is this
otra de
another
las
lesson
lecciones
that
que
the
nos
world
deja
is
el
teaching
mundo en
us
tiempos de
in
pandemia?
terms of pandemic?
Mis invitados justamente han
Our
reflexionado
guests are
sobre este
reflecting on
particular,
this,
sin
and
ninguna
without a
duda.
doubt.
Por hoy cerramos el
For
tablero
today, we're
geopolítico.
closing our
Hasta la
geopolitical
próxima.
board. Until next time.